Welcome back. Thanks for staying on. Let's turn to this now. Cosatu is calling for the urgent signing of the Municipal Structures Amendment Bill, which aims to assist in the managing of coalitions and the formation of coalitions in the various councils in South Africa. Now, some parties have rejected the draft law over worrying parts in the draft. We'll discuss those with Cosatu's Parliamentary Coordinator, Matthew Parks, who's joining us now for more on that. Good to have you, Matthew, and thank you very much for your time. First and foremost, what's the importance of having this conversation now when it seems as though the political developments in the country with the formation now of the government of national unity, provincial governments of national unity has kind of overtaken this process?
Good evening. Thanks for having us. Look, we still have government beyond elections. We'll have local elections in about 2 years' time. And I think we've all seen now that you have coalitions as part of the South African landscape. We've seen since 2016 how many municipalities, especially in the big urban centers like Johannesburg, Tshwane, Ekurhuleni, Nelson Mandela Bay, even eThekwini, you will struggle to see a majority party. And there's a consequence. When there's frequent instability at a government level, it disrupts public services or municipal services. Often critical delivery to the public, to working class communities, takes a backseat to political intrigue and infighting. And so we need to find a framework which provides stability, provides some framework, some guidelines, some plan Bs in case of instability, to make sure that government can continue on its business. And of course, we saw more recently in the national and provincial elections that not only nationally did not have an outright majority party, but even in about 4 provinces too. So it doesn't need to have it. This is the draft amendment bill by the Department of Cooperative Governance. It follows a discussion that took place last year at the University of the Western Cape, hosted by the presidency, to say how can we begin to nudge some consensus amongst the major political parties about a framework to ensure stability at government. The bill is focusing on local government, but we also need to have a similar discussion at national and provincial government too, because the principles remain relevant there. Yeah. And I think now is the time to do it. You don't want to do this thing simply when there's a crisis, when we have elections producing instability and so forth. We need to do it now. We need to look at what are the modalities to help achieve consensus where coalitions develop, and also help make sure things happen if there's a difficulty in achieving coalition as well.
Hence the good party saying, withdraw this now at least, fix whatever issues are, but come back with a legislation that looks at all spheres, because this one is really focusing on local government. But now we have learned that coalitions are now a reality, really, even at national, which is what we're dealing with. If you ask the DA, they'll tell you it's a grand coalition. Yes, the ANC says it's a government of national unity. Essentially, it's parties coming together having to agree. So have a new bill that speaks to all spheres of government, national, provincial, and local.
Yeah, look, the court is being a little bit silly. They should rather make proposals on how to strengthen the bill, because as Cosatu, we think there are some areas where it needs to be strengthened. For example, we should have a set time frame within which if a coalition cannot be formed, what then do we do? Right now, under the law, the only thing you can do is to call a fresh election if a municipality, for example, doesn't elect office bearers or pass a budget within a certain time frame. And that doesn't really assist, because all you then do is simply tell voters to go back to elections. Most likely you'll come with the same results, a great cost and disruption, etc. It doesn't really help resolve the issue. We should rather be saying that if a municipality or a provincial legislature or even national parliament, if it can't do the 2 fundamental essential responsibilities they are entrusted with by the Constitution, one is to elect leadership, the president or premier or mayor or speakers. The second is to pass the budgets. Everything else after that has become secondary. Those are the 2 fundamental issues for governance to take place. We should be saying that, look, that the bills do need to be amended to deal with that issue, to say within a certain reasonable time frame. It might be 30 days, it might be 60 days, shouldn't be too short, allow space for some negotiations, but also shouldn't be too long, that you avoid the kind of the anarchy you saw in Belgium a couple of years ago when they had no government for 2 years. We should be having some discussion about what is the right amount, what is the right balance for how often you can have a vote of no confidence in the executive. Yeah. You don't want a scenario where you have that every single day like you saw in some municipalities, because that just becomes anarchy. It distracts politicians from doing good governance. But there needs to be a fair amount. The bill's a little bit too broad in its prescriptions where it proposes 1 year. That's a little bit too extreme. But look, so we need to find, so what is the right rationale for it? And you also need to find a scenario that if you, for example, can't achieve governance, could you go back to the mayoral committee system where each party is represented in the executive proportionally? So those are the kind of discussion we should be having.
Yeah.
We have a bit of space because local elections are in 2 years' time, but that's not a huge amount of time because on average it takes Parliament about 2 years to pass legislation.
Yes.
So saying take this bill away and come back later doesn't help. Let's rather discuss it now, get things moving. It is a draft bill, so the COGTA is correctly asking for public comment. We had quite a useful discussion last year at UWC with political parties across Parliament. But now is the time to have that discussion and to avoid rushing things like we did with the Electoral Amendment Act just before the elections. We need to have discussions in good space, good time, because society also needs to have its input to say, yes, this makes sense, or no, this doesn't make sense. But this is going to be a journey. I think we're going to have to adopt our electoral and our governance laws a couple of times over the next 2 terms of government because our democracy is evolving. In the last May elections, independents were allowed to stand for the first time. So you can see we need to tweak it here and there each time, see what works, what doesn't work. And let's take a minimalist approach as well because you don't want to make too many changes at once, which creates unintended consequences. So I think for us, let's have these discussions, and the more we can have them, the more we'll find better solutions.
While on that, I mean, there's of course 2 caveats that the bodies have actually looked at, or stakeholders, democracy, governance, politics organizations that have looked at. One of them is exactly what you're saying. The Principal Act says that in a hung municipality, the system should be able to resolve itself within 40 days. So executive position and so on and so forth should be replaced within 14 days. This amendment now says that the MEC must bring in a collective executive system in hung municipalities within 30 days. Where does Cosatu sit on that? I mean, we've seen now how, for example, the Gauteng government had difficulty forming within the prescribed time. It actually took quite long to form that government, where in eThekwini and other places, that process would have happened much quicker.
No, look, the principle is correct that if the political parties can't form a government, be it at national, municipal, or provincial level, within a set time frame, 30 days might be a little bit tight. Perhaps 60 days or 45 days is more reasonable. But again, you don't want to go too far either because you still do need to see public services, municipal services being delivered to communities. You need to find people getting down to the basis of governance, etc. So you need to find what is a reasonable time frame. But it makes sense to say, in the event that you can't achieve a government, rather than go to fresh elections, let's rather than impose immediately some sort of formula like the proportional or the mayoral committee system, where then each of the big parties is automatically represented in the executive committee or the provincial executive council or cabinet, as it may be. That makes sense. And you'd rather do that now because the difficulty we've had previously, in fact, since the early 2000s, the Western Cape, the Eastern Cape, at times when the provincial MECs wanted to introduce that, they wanted to do that after elections that took place. And so that created a bit of, anger amongst the political parties who felt they were being locked out of governance, etc. And it was taken to court, and the aggrieved parties won it in court. So you'd rather put it in place in law right now, make it very clear that if you don't achieve a government, if you don't pass the budget, you don't elect leadership, then this is what will happen. That is a useful formula because it's going to help nudge conversations quickly. It's going to help move parties towards good governance and towards being a little bit more sober, etc. But one thing it won't resolve is that who then becomes mayor, who becomes speaker, who becomes the municipal mayoral council for finance, etc. So political parties still are going to have to find a way to talk to each other, find consensus, or we're going to have to find, for example, could you look at having an instance, whether it's the MEC or some external party playing a mediating role. But ultimately, the law can do so much. It can nudge parties so far, and also the political parties too must take responsibility. But at least what we can do in the law is to provide some framework, some guidance to ensure stability. And I think also we need to have a discussion about, do we really want, for example, a Nelson Mandela Bay or Johannesburg type scenario where within 4 years you have 5 or 7 or 8 mayors? Does that really make sense?
Yeah.
And I think we need to have a discussion about what's the right formula, not to interfere with democracy, but also we need to say what is going to enhance good governance and enhance service delivery to working class communities.
Thresholds is one issue that the ACDP has raised as legislative overreach because it hampers diversity and inclusivity, to say, now, if I'm a small party and I don't meet that threshold and therefore I cannot bring a vote of no confidence.
Yeah, look, that's increasingly become a difficult issue. In 1994, South Africa deliberately chose a proportional representation system for the National Assembly and across governance to include all different political viewpoints, from the extreme right of the Freedom Front Plus and the IFP to the left of the PAC and so forth. So everybody had a stake in the system because you're coming from a very fractious and a very divisive and violent past. You wanted all political views included and being part of the system. The difficulty there is that you can find yourself in a scenario like Italy or Israel, where they cannot form a majority government, where they change prime ministers every few months. I think Italy had about 50 prime ministers in 50 years. So the level of instability and chaos isn't a good model to follow. And we've seen now in South Africa, we've moved from about 13 parties to about 18 parties in parliament. Some of them are very, very small, with one seat, etc. So it doesn't make sense to say, can we have a 1% threshold, for example? If you had a 1% threshold in National Assembly, I think you'd have about 5 or 6 parties right now, as opposed to 18 or so. That's useful in terms of bring a bit more stability, less fragmentation, etc. I think the one difficulty now, though, is that legally independents have been allowed by the Constitutional Court to stand for Parliament and also for the provincial legislatures. So it's very difficult to have a percentage threshold when you allow independence, because you can't chop a person into half a body. It's going to make it very difficult. So I think that's the one difficult. I think that vote might have sailed past. But look, it's still worth a discussion. But by and large, the threshold has actually been determined by the size of the legislature or the municipality already. So it kind of is there. I think what you can do for the votes of no confidence is you could rather say, how often can you have a vote of no confidence? Perhaps you don't allow it any day of the week that you want it. Perhaps you allow it once a quarter. And in the meantime, at least government can get on the business with governance. But at least there is some useful clauses in the bill itself, which says, despite any limitation on how often you can call a vote of no confidence, if there's allegations of criminality and so forth, then a vote of no confidence can be held immediately, because you would not want to continue with criminals sitting in office for obvious reasons.
Yeah. The transparency of the process has also come into play, because you would have known recently when there are, for example, fractious relationships within political parties, be it the Democratic Alliance, be it the ANC, where some members of the party would want to support a motion of no confidence while others would not want to do so. The question of whether secrecy should prevail or not has also come into question. What is your view on how to lessen the pressure and lessen vote buying on the councillors?
No, look, I mean, that's a difficult one. It's a difficult one because, the secret ballot was introduced during the Zuma administration because there was fears of intimidation of some members of the ANC, members of parliament in the ANC. Could they be allowed to vote according to their conscience, etc., in a very, very difficult chapter for the ANC. But also, I think at the same time, one also has to balance that, people vote for the political party. They don't vote for person X or person Y, who happens to be the party representative in the South Africa system. So voters do have a right to expect the party discipline to maintain. So it's a bit of a difficult one. There are pros and cons to both sides. But I think the principle is the more transparency you have in a system, the more difficult it is for corruption to creep in. That's why, for example, Parliament has always recorded who votes for what so that you could see. And I think we must also be a little bit wary of sometimes going too far to the extreme to the Western model, because some people would want to put the US or the British models on a pedestal. And often you see those political systems are riddled with corruption, where big business can buy the votes of a member of parliament or a congressman simply by writing a big check for the election campaign. So I think when we look at international best practice, let's also look at international worst practice too. Let's avoid repeating those mistakes as we evolve our own democracy and try to say what makes sense for the South African circumstance. The Political Party Funding Act was overhauled a couple of years ago because we had begun to see corruption growing there, where a businessman could simply write a check for a political party in government. And nowadays, most political parties have got a seat in government at some different level of the state. And so we need to also really make sure we have as much transparency as possible to protect those parties from the temptations of corruption, and of course to protect the state and society from the consequences of corruption.
Yeah. Some experts are saying, Matthew, that we are tinkering with the wrong things. The formation of coalitions is not the problem. The kingmaker status is not the problem. Whether it's a small party or a big party, a threshold and whatever not, is not the problem. The problem is parties learning to read electoral outcomes and be able to marry that with governance outcomes. And that's what we're failing to do.
No, yeah. Look, there's validity to that point. But look, to be fair to South Africa and fair to the political parties, most of them are brand new to this game. We've really only had coalitions at a national level since 2016 with the local elections, where we saw it across municipalities. And, yes, you're right. For the first 2 terms, it was an absolute fiasco. It was a disaster. It was a circus on steroids. What happened in Nelson Mandela Bay, where mayors were chopped left, right, and center, and Joburg too, made a mockery of the exercise. So I think that's been a useful learning curve as well for the big political parties, especially the ANC, to see what works, what doesn't work. For society also to evolve too, to say what things can we accept, what we can't accept. And I think that experience has helped. Even the negative experience, which we all shudder to think about, has helped focus politicians in the recent national elections to move very quickly to put together a government of national unity, encompassing about 10 or so political parties with very different ideological views, from the FF Plus on the right to the PAC on the left, the IFP somewhere in between, and so forth. I think that experience helped them, and I think you're seeing that experience also now, for example, the ANC Gauteng, trying to say, some of these things don't make sense. Let's rather fix them, and let's rather pursue things which do make sense, and let's see how to use them to enhance good governance. Because I think if you listen to the Premier of Gauteng this weekend, he made some very sober statements that what you see in Johannesburg is an example of how coalitions need to be handled with care to avoid the very depressing state of affairs in Joburg.
But it's precisely that, as you bring out the Johannesburg Council, where you would have had a fairly stable agreement and arrangement happening between the parties, and the executive seats were distributed, compromise was made to say the smaller party takes the mayorship. It did not necessarily translate into better service delivery. So you can have a structured coalition agreement in place that seemingly supports stability, but it doesn't go to say that is going to give the outcomes.
No, and I think that's also a critical point. The law can do so much. The law can say by which period you must form a coalition government, and if you don't, what is the next way forward? The law can have a plan B of saying we'll have an inclusive executive committee or merit committee system, rather, if you can't form a stable government. But the law can't force politicians to grow up. The law can't force politicians to make smart choices and not to make dumb choices. So at times, people are going to make silly choices, and there's going to be the consequence. At times, you are going to see a mayor from a party which could only get 4,000 votes in a city of about 4 million people. Doesn't make sense. And people are going to have to learn from those mistakes. And I think that's been the useful experience of coalitions and municipalities in the past decade. People have seen what things you shouldn't do. And I think hopefully that begins to sober people up. I mean, Nelson Mandela Bay should be a role model of exactly what political parties don't do. And I think you've seen after as a consequence, many of the bigger political parties have decided these are certain things we shouldn't be repeating and trying to adjust as a consequence afterwards. So that the law can't fix, but experience can be a useful teacher in that regard. Yeah.
What to do next now? I mean, as you put it, the next local government elections, 2026 or so. What is Cosatu saying should happen now?
Yeah, so look, I mean, we were a little bit disappointed that the bill already released now, but we understood the logic because we had this discussion last year, hosted by the presidency. It would have been useful to already have some of these building blocks in place, but perhaps it was too close to the elections. So we had this bill. It's been released for public comment until the end of August. It'll be useful for society organizations with expertise to make comments, what works, doesn't work. But I think also to push from a scene of consensus, of pragmatism and practicality, as opposed to some of these kind of polarizing extreme inputs. But we would want to see that COGTA does take it to Cabinet and table it at Parliament at least by December this year, so that Parliament next year can work its way through it calmly in a sober discussion and have extensive public hearings, so that it can then be passed into law by the end of next year and come into effect by the 2026 local elections. So you see how tight timeframes are. To get a bill through Parliament within a year is very tight, to be honest. But we need to have this thing, and I think perhaps we should simply have a minimalist approach to say, if a government cannot be formed within 30 days or 45 days, the mayoral committee system kicks into effect. And the criteria is you must pass a budget, you must elect leadership. And if you don't, this is the consequences. Maybe perhaps the issue of how often you can have votes or no comments. If you could just stick even just to those two things, I think you would find consensus fairly quickly. And I think legally wouldn't be too difficult to conclude drafting those bills. And that won't be too divisive either. I think most political parties who are sober, leave aside those who are not sober, they will never agree to anything. But I think then you will find a significant majority consensus in Parliament that could pass quite quickly. And I think society could also understand it too, because ultimately you need a political governance system which is simple for ordinary persons to understand and to have a sense of ownership around it. If it becomes too complex, people won't be able to understand it. And that's when you find the chasm between the electorate and the governance growing, and that becomes very dangerous politically for society.
Matthew Parks, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on. Speaking for Cosatu there, Matthew Parks, Parliamentary Coordinator for the Federation. Right, so let's take a break. More news, top of the hour. Stay with us.